Horizon Africa is a boutique investment banking advisory firm established about 4 years ago. And the services that it focuses on providing are mergers and acquisition advisory across East Africa, capital raising, debt, equity, mezzanine, and so forth, and capital advisory business, which is essentially around advising clients on balance sheet restructure, capital structuring, tech structure, desktop due diligence, desktop business planning, and valuation analysis. And as I mentioned, we work across the various geographies of East Africa: Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, including DRC as well. And we don't particularly focus on any specific industry. As you know, that the East African countries are fairly small on their own, so you can't be a specialist practitioner. You have to keep your practice fairly generalist because there aren't enough deals in specific industries. Having said that, there are certain industries that we are quite well experienced with. So industries like agro-processing, FMCG, heavy and light manufacturing, large real estate transactions, large commodity and trade finance transaction, financial institution transactions. Those are really the areas that we really do a lot of focus. I will now move on to the presentation. So the idea of the presentation is really around talking about the private equity and investment landscape in East Africa. What we will cover are essentially the key macroeconomic themes in East Africa. Then we will focus on really two categories of investors. What you have are strategic investors, and what you have are financial stroke private equity type investors. Then the idea is to talk about what are these investors looking for? What concerns them? What are the areas that they focus their diligence on, right, when they are looking at particular investee transactions? One of the other things that you have to kind of think about as you talk internally in your firms about incoming strategic investors or financial investors are, what are the considerations? The considerations could be from a taxation point of view. It could be from an organizational structure point of view. It could be from a governance point of view, right? So it's always good to have that debate going on internally. If you're a family-owned business, within your family. If you're a close-knit group of shareholders, then within your shareholding, okay? So I'll start with some macroeconomic themes. If you look at East Africa and the East African community, we've just outlined some key figures. So what's the total population, right? You're looking at literally about 130 million people. What's the total GDP, nominal and real GDP, and then GDP per capita. The idea is what it tells you is that the East African region is fairly large, and there is merit in East African community coming together, right? We are almost as large as a region as Nigeria. Makes it very attractive for large international strategic players, makes it very attractive for large private equity investors. Because through East Africa, we now, companies can have a regional footprint, which is what most of the strategic players and financial investors are looking for, right? Then, some thoughts about what's happening with our GDP growth. Our GDP is, on average, across the region is going to grow at about 6%, right? That's fairly decent compared to Europe, North America, or even compared to what's happening in Asian countries. India is slowing down, China is slowing down, although they are registering large GDP growth still comparatively, but they're slowing down. Whereas the sense in Africa is that Africa as a continent and specific regions are just picking up. So the view is 6% is just a start. Where does that take us from there, right? And then look at, I mean, the GDP, combined GDP is $100 billion. Admittedly, not a very large figure when you think about European economies or North American economies, but still a very sizable figure compared to the other African regions. Yeah. This slide just gives you a sense of what I just talked about. What's happening? How are we growing in our GDP? So 5-year average growth, right? And what is the forecast? Look at Kenya. We achieved slightly above 4%, and we are expected to achieve an average of 6+% over a 2012-2015 period, right? Look at Uganda, look at Tanzania, look at Rwanda. Rwanda and South Sudan have a smaller base, which they're growing from. So you just need to kind of take that into account when people talk about 6 or 7 or 8% growth in Rwanda. It's not the same as 6% growth in Kenya, which has a much bigger base, right? And look at where the world is, right? The average growth in the world. So it tells you that East Africa is a fairly dynamic region. A lot of people, a lot of money is looking to park itself in East African transactions. Yeah. Now we get into the discussion around strategic investors, and we'll then talk about private equity type investors. So first and foremost, what is a strategic investor? By definition, a strategic investor is a multinational or a multi-regional company that has typically similar line of businesses to the companies that are targeting, okay? And they have a strategic long-term view for taking a stake in these companies. That stake typically could be majority, a simple majority, all the way to 100%, okay? So you can have these multinationals coming from Asia, Africa, other parts of Africa, especially South Africa or Nigeria, Middle East, Asia. So if you think about, in our context, what's happening today, right? Historically, we had a lot of multinational interest from Europe and North America, right? So you had the likes of Unilever, Procter & Gamble, you know, the big pharma companies, the big tobacco companies, the big automobile companies, right? That trend is changing. We've all seen that. You then have interest now coming in from people like Tiger Brands, right? Tiger Brands acquired a majority stake in Hako Industries. That was a strategic play, right? You look at what's happening from the various Asian countries, especially India and China, Middle East. There is a lot of large players looking at specific industries. Could be FMCG, could be power related, could be automobile related. I mean, I know of 2 or 3 Chinese automobile companies, heavy truck manufacturers, tractor manufacturers, who are looking for strategic players in this market to take a stake in, right? Same thing with Middle Eastern companies. A lot of the large Middle Eastern players, especially infrastructure related, you know, people who are engineering firms, road contractors, infrastructure developers, they are looking at coming into East Africa. About a year and a half ago, we advised actually a year ago, we advised a Middle Eastern company that specializes in cement manufacturing across 6 geographies to look at a joint venture in Mozambique, right, with a local partner. We're doing a similarly advisory work for a Nepalese Indian group. We found them a joint venture partner for their East Africa hospitality play, right? So these are the opportunities that are coming. And it's not only for your existing businesses where they want to take a stake. If they find the right partners, they don't have a problem creating greenfield joint ventures as well, okay? So these are some of the areas, and what attracts them, whether it's private equity, whether it's strategic. So what you have to think about is, as the population grows, as the middle classes grow, what are the industries that will grow with those middle classes, right? So FMCG is, of course, a no-brainer. Financial services is another one. Infrastructure service providers, such as cement manufacturers, steel, timber, paint, any of those. So as your economies grow, these are the industries that will benefit, right? So that's the way the big infrastructure companies globally or the big manufacturing companies are thinking. They see the way East African economies are going to grow, how individual companies will grow, and which companies to then target. Okay? We've just outlined, so again, what are the advantages of a strategic partner versus a financial investor? Okay? What you get is various things. You could get access to technology, right? If they are a big African player, you have access to Pan-African distribution. You could have access to cheaper raw material, okay, because they're probably buying at a group level large bulk quantities. And if you come under their umbrella, you could benefit from some of those bulk purchasing rights, right? A lot of times it's about reputation enhancement. It's about, bringing in experts in those fields. You can also, other thing that you'll find is that strategic partners, because they have a strategic long-term view, tend to pay higher than financial investor partners, right? So look at what some of the big breweries have, one or two of the breweries that have entered the Ethiopian market, what they've paid for the local Ethiopian breweries. We don't know the exact figure, but ranges are literally EBITDA multiples of 15, 18, up to 20 times, right? You won't find even very good FMCG companies probably could attract 7, maybe 8 at most, 8 times EBITDA multiple at most, right? Why? Because Ethiopia is a big market. It has a very low per capita consumption of beer and spirits. So for the Guinnesses of this world, it's a big market to get into. They are paying for a strategic foot in the door, right? That's what they're paying for. So you've got to, that's the way they're going to look at it, right? Tiger Brands. How has HACO benefited? If there was an analysis that was done that the previous owners who are now a minority shareholder, I think they're at about 30% or 35%. Their total value currently that they have of that 30% is worth more than when they were valued before Tiger Brands came in, right? So gives you an idea of what a strategic investor can do for you if things go right, okay? All right, so go on, Kevin.
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you quickly. Why would they want the strategic investor? Why do they need you instead of starting out their own venture?
Sure. So think about it this way, right? Whether let's say you're a new player in a country. You could be in the country, or you could be a foreigner, right? And let's say you want to get into steel, right? So what are you going to do? You're going to look at the steel. You're going to study the steel industry, right? What are you going to find in the steel industry today? You're going to find big players, whether it's hot rolling or cold rolling. You're going to find established players who have massive investments that they have made over the last 8, 10, 20 years. You'll find they have a strategic access to scrap material, right? You will find that a lot of the old players, plants are paid off, so they don't really have long-term debt concerns. You will also find that the distribution network is very tightly knit, right? So as a new player, whether you're an international player or whether you're a local player, it's going to take you 2 to 3 years to establish a plant, maybe another 2 to 3 years to actually break into the market, right? And get to the level of utilization of your productivity that you want to get to. Could easily take you 5 years before you come to a level of competing at a level playing field, right? So then you make a decision. What do you say? If you're a steel player, you say to yourself, makes more sense that I should buy an existing player or invest in an existing player, right? Because it's about timing. It's about trying to break into the market, right? So That applies to if you're a paint group, right? There are about 4 companies in Kenya that control about 70 or 80% of the market, right? So if you're a new global paint company, what are you going to do? Does it make, or even if you're an existing group in Kenya wanting to get into the paint industry, what are you going to do? Are you going to take them head on with a 30, 40, $50 million investment, or you're better off buying one of them, right? So those are some of the strategic questions that you have to ask yourself as an investor. If you look at, again, L'Oreal investing in interconsumer, right? That's the same thought process they went through, right? Because L'Oreal had been present through a distribution network in East Africa. But when they looked around, they realized that to properly break into the market, because again, L'Oreal's market is a European audience. Interconsumer's market is an African audience, right? For them to break into that market was very difficult, very different mindset. You need a paradigm shift to kind of start thinking that way, to provide for that market. So they did their analysis, market analysis, macro analysis, micro analysis, and they said, makes sense for us to acquire L'Oreal, even at a premium, right? So there are various examples of these, right? Okay. If you can talk about private equity, so your private equity investors, your typical private equity investor is a financial investor. They'll give you money, right? But they are backing you as existing players to manage and lead the company, okay? Private equity investors are basically, they are a source of funding for you. So you may, as a family or as a privately held group, you may have different motives for involving a private equity group. Your motive could be that you have exhausted your debt capacity and you really need additional equity in the business, right? Or you are preparing yourself for a much bigger play, could be a listing, right? Could be a trade sale in a few years' time to an international group. But what you need is the kind of intangible things that a private equity group can do, right? Things like improve your corporate governance, get you a bit more organized, help you think through institutionalizing your company, succession planning, bring in a younger generation, groom them, and so forth, right? So a lot of family-owned and privately owned companies look at private equity as a kind of a first step towards a listing or a trade sale, okay? And there is literature that would show you that the valuations that you can achieve in the market once you have had institutional investors, you get a slightly higher premium. Because when you go to the market for an IPO or when you do a trade sale, at that time, investors or acquirers have a comfort that there is an institutional investor that's already in, and they have done a fair amount of work to bring you up the corporate governance curve. Okay. We've just highlighted some of the private equity transactions that have been done in Kenya in the last few years. So you've got, in financial services, you've got Helios buying a minority stake into Equity Bank. You've got Actis's investment in the Garden City Mall. You've got ECP actually buying a majority, almost 80 or 90% of the Java Coffee House. Catalyst Investment making a majority investment in Chai Bora in Tanzania. You've got Duet Private Equity buying into Dashan Breweries in Ethiopia. And then, healthcare, you've got Abraj buying into Wine Pharmaceuticals, Fanisi buying into Sofar, which I believe is in Rwanda, right? So these are some of the transactions. There are quite a lot of transactions happening, right? So just a quick one in terms of what is the private equity landscape in Africa. First of all, a lot of the big deals are actually happening in South Africa and Nigeria. They have the scale, right? We have a lot of private equity groups we work with. They say, look, I want to do a $50 million transaction. in this market, there are probably 10 companies that you can do a $50 million transaction because, again, it's a minority play, which means that they are looking to invest in companies that have a pre-money value, that is pre-investment value of 60, 70, 80 million dollars, right? How many companies are there that have those kind of valuations, right? So you'll find those companies in West Africa, especially in Nigeria. You'll find those companies in South Africa. You'll find those companies in Egypt. Difficult to find those companies in East Africa, right? So the big transactions are happening in West Africa, Nigeria, especially, Egypt. Of course, this is pre their issues that they've had, and South Africa. But the deal flow is picking up in East Africa, especially in the mid-cap market. What I would say is the $2 million to $20 million market, right? So what's happening is so East African firms are primarily SME focused. The other interesting development in the private equity world in East Africa is up till 5, 6, 7 years ago, you had people like Actis, Oreos. They had a Pan-African view. So they will have an office in Kenya. Or somebody out of the London office will be looking at Kenya. Two things are happening. Number one, there are a lot of East Africa specific private equity groups that have come up that are focused on East Africa. So you've got people like Catalyst, you've got people like Phoenici, you've got people like TBL Mera Fund, right? Focused on East Africa. Pearl Capital, focused on East Africa, based in East Africa. Secondly, some of the big London-based private equity groups that were investing in Africa, they are now opening offices in East Africa. Primarily, they choose Kenya, Nairobi, a lot of time because of its access to East Africa and to London, Dubai, etc. But they're doing transactions across East Africa. So if you look at Helios, they've set up an office here. If you look at Abraj, they have through Oreos, they've set up an office here, right? So more and more, the trend is to have a local office because that's how they're going to generate deal flows, right? So again, just to give you just a view of who is playing in which sector. So the way we look at private equity is we kind of tier it into three different tiers, right? So you've got private equity groups that are investing in the $500,000 to $5 million space. You've got 5 private equity groups investing between 5 and 20 and 20 plus. And admittedly, there is some overlap, right? So the guys who are doing 5 to 20, sometimes they'll do a $3 million deal as well. The guys who are doing 20 plus, sometimes they'll do a $15 million deal as well, right? So you've got to $500,000 to $5 million, you've got Phoenici, you've got TBL Mera Fund, Grofin, Pearl Capital, Jacana Partners. Those are the key players in the East African context, right? And all of them have offices in Kenya. Okay. Then you've got in the 5 to 20, you've got Catalyst, Oreos, Abraj, Fatisa, Adlevo, and so forth. And who are the big 20 plus? So Helios, Satya, ECP. You've got Duet as well. You've got DPI, Development Partner International. So we've just mentioned 3, but there are at least 7, 8 of them who are looking at doing $20 million plus type deals. Okay. So what happens what are the exit options? So when you think about strategic play, strategics are there to stay in the long term. So when a strategic multinational comes and buys 60, 70, 80% into your company, they're there to stay, right? The problem with private equity group is private equity group have a finite horizon because they have to return money back to their investors. So they will invest money with you for anywhere from 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and then they have to exit. What are the ways that they exit? First, listing, right? So you have to be careful. Listing is overused sometimes. Listing is not that easy. Listing has a big cost to it, especially if you're a smaller company. It can be very costly. And then you got to time it right. If unfortunately, if the exit period is around a bear market, you will not get the value, right? So one has to be very careful about listing. By listing, you're going to be releasing a lot of information into the public domain, which may be detrimental to your competitive advantage, for example, right? So got to be careful about listing. Another way is a trade sale, right? Again, trade sale, not that easy, especially for smaller companies. We all think, oh, there's a Middle Eastern company or a South African company or an Indian company waiting to buy our company, right? Not that easy. Try to get an Indian group out of bed for a $10 million deal, and they won't even call you back. 3 years ago, we were trying to we were advising on a 80 megawatt power project, which is about $110 million, which is sizable by any standard in East Africa. And we were put in touch with 2 or 3 of the big power boys in India, and we called them. And the message was unanimous. Don't call us unless it's a minimum 500 megawatt power project. 500 megawatt. It's like $700, $800 million, right? And so when you talk to any of these mid-sized Indian or Middle Eastern group, none of them want to look at anything below $30, $40 million, right? So when you are a small company with a $5, $8, $10 million turnover, and you have a small private equity investor, trade sale, difficult, especially from a strategic. You could have a trade sale within an East African context. But then, issue is, will another East African group pay you the multiples that you expect to be paid, right? Certain challenges. Third exit mechanism, which I'd like you to think very carefully about, because if you're not careful, you can get yourself into a big issue, is what private equity groups do typically is in their term sheet and in their financial documents, they'll put in a put option. They'll have a put option and a call option, right? What they're trying to do is making sure that if an IPO listing is not possible, if a trade sale is not possible, they will try to sell the shares that they acquired back to you, right? And depending on how well you negotiate, it can be at 20, 25, 30% IRR, right? Very dangerous. You've got to think carefully. If you haven't got good advice, you can get into some serious trouble. At the moment, I'm actually involved in resolving one such case where one of the investee companies had a similar arrangement 4 years, 5 years ago, and they're in serious trouble. Because typically a privately owned company that invites a private equity investor in doesn't have a lot of cash outside of the company. A lot of times their wealth is tied into that company, right? So let's say a guy, private equity investor comes and invests $5 million in your company. And most of that money has actually gone into your company because you need it for growth, right? And private equity groups typically will not give you money for a share purchase in your pocket. They'll give money for growth. And what they typically will do is they'll tie you in through a put option that if in 4 years, 5 years' time, they can't exit through the first two mechanisms, they'll sell it back to you. And imagine if they have a 2x, what they got in 2 times, sometimes 3 times, they can sell it back to you at $10 million. You have to pay them $10 million, right? Imagine that. I mean, do you think you'll have $10 million to pay them? And what happens if you can't pay them, right? If you can't pay them, depends on what security they've taken. A lot of times they can ask for security over your remaining shares, which means they can exercise that pledge and take over 100% of the company. I'm not trying to make them out to be devil incarnate, but you've got to be careful how you negotiate with them. And it's always good to have good legal and financial advice when you're negotiating with private equity groups. Remember, private equity, the smart private equity money has no other motive than to return good 25, 30% IRRs to their investors. And the only way they can do that are through some of these terms and conditions with their investing company. So you have to be very careful from the onset when you're negotiating with private equity groups, what are the terms and conditions that you're signing up to. And if you can convince a private equity group that you are the person who can do these things, they'll make that money available to you for growth purposes, right? So So you need to prove to them that you are the management team, or you have the management team to implement the business plan that you've put together. Okay? You should have some level of corporate governance in place before a private equity group comes in, right? So your typical family-owned business, even large ones, they do board meetings over lunch, or, brothers meet together, or son and father meet together, have a coffee and decide on key issues. That's fine. But at some point, you need to formalize that. You need to minute your board meetings. You need to pass good resolutions. You've got to have more in-depth memos and articles, and you have, depending on whether you can afford it or not, how big your size is, maybe have a few professional employees that work side by side with you in running the company. Yeah. Private equity groups love companies with multi-country footprint, right? And the reason for that is for them, it ticks a critical box, which is geopolitical risk, right? So if you're in 3 countries, something happens in Kenya, at least your Tanzania and Uganda business will go on. What worries us most are every 5 years we have elections, right? So, and good thing is not all 3 countries have elections at the same time. So that's how they look at spreading geopolitical risk, okay? So they like companies with good multi-country footprints. The other thing what they like to see is, does your company have a better chance of achieving higher growth than the industry at large? What kind of competitive advantage do you have compared to your, and you may not have been able to achieve that, maybe because of capital. So they don't consider that. I mean, they understand that capital could be shortcoming, but really they want to understand what are the core competencies you have as a company to really outpace your competitors. And I will tell you one thing, that private equity groups are very thorough in their due diligence. A lot of times what we do is we put up a business plan, right? It shows 10% growth or 15% standard growth, and we tell them, this is our business plan, right? Last year we did $1 million EBITDA. Next year we're going to do a $4 million EBITDA, right? They are also very smart. They will test that. They will test it historically. How did you perform versus the budget that you had prepared, right? And that's how they're going to kind of catch you out if you have not thought through your business plans, right? Another way they could do it is they could have clawback arrangement or performance-based, upscaling of valuation marks, right? So they'll say, fine, you're telling us next year you'll do a $4 million EBITDA, whereas this year you're going to do 1.5. So in 18 months or 2 years' time, when you achieve that, we'll give you a higher valuation. That's called a clawback, right? So you've got to have a lot of thought that must go into preparing your business plan, especially for the purposes of bringing in a private equity investor. Yeah. Now, one other thing about family-owned or privately held company is a lot of times they think of private equity money as very expensive money. And it is expensive money because you're parting with your shareholding, right? But it's unfair to a certain extent to compare it to debt, because debt is debt, equity is equity, right? Because equity is unsecured, okay? The equity holders have the last call on capital. Everybody else does before you, right? Senior debt, junior debt, creditors, pref shares, then equity, okay? So you have to be mentally prepared to accept this money. If you're not, as a family or as a group of shareholders, if you're not prepared for dilution, then the private equity discussion is not going to be very productive. You have to be mentally prepared for dilution. What happens a lot of times is, you see, private equity is still relatively new in this market, right? So a lot of times what happens is your typical family, even large ones, right? They say, yeah, sure, we'll talk to them. Let's learn what they have. And then you get into a discussion where you continue talking. Term sheets are issued. private equity groups have started flying in people, right? Hiring consultants to look at it. They're not charging you anything, but they're incurring charges, okay? And then at some point, let's say you are a family of 5 or 6 people or 3 people, whatever, right? And then the family patriarch says, who is probably in his 60s, he says, no way. Our family is not going to have an outsider shareholder, right? We don't do dilution. We'll borrow more money, but we won't dilute, right? Now, the younger generation may have been all excited about bringing in this private equity group. Suddenly, the older generation put their foot down, right? So it's always better to have that buy-in before you go too far, right? And I'm just giving you a generational gap example, but it could be for various reasons. Sometimes people just have cold feet right at the end, right? They just suddenly realize, no, let me run the way I am running. If I make any mistakes, it's for me to pay for, right? I don't want an external shareholder and suddenly I'm obligated. A lot of times you realize that yes, they will have board seats, but there could be interference, right? Because they will have very strong minority rights, right? They will want to have a say in major capex items that you're going to invest in. They're going to have a say in hiring at certain level and above. They're going to have a say in any acquisitions that you plan to do or any disposals that you plan to do. They're going to have a say in your expansion strategy, right? So, and they will have minority protections right, which means, they will not allow for perhaps further dilution, or if there's an equity call, they could come up with a check. Can you come up with a check, right? They will have tag-along and drag-along rights, right? Tag-along right means that if you find a buyer or somebody to acquire your shares, they can tag along with you to benefit from that. A drag-along is if they find a buyer who's paying good price, regardless of whether you want to sell or not, regardless of the fact that you are a majority shareholder, they can drag you with them, right? So when you actually really start studying the term sheet and the other transaction documents, that's when you realize what you're getting into, right? Because what's going to happen is the first 4 or 5 discussions will be about them educating you what is private equity, right? Then you will have your internal discussions. You will get used to the idea. Some members of the family will say, okay, let's go ahead. They issue a term sheet. And suddenly reality strikes you that it's not as simple as taking bank's money, right? This is now you're getting into bed for the long term. You can hire a consultant, but he's a consultant or she's a consultant, a paid person. They will sing to your tune, right? And you are the 100% shareholder, right? What's different about a private equity group is they become an equity partner. So they have a say in the way the company is run. And they're not going to just sing to your tune, right? That's the measure of true corporate governance, right? So you can institute various measures to improve your corporate governance, but at the end of the day, it's like a multi-party country trying to do all of this without having a single-party country trying to do all of this without having a multi-party democracy, right? It's a similar thought process, right? Unless you have a genuine outside shareholder, the company is still susceptible to that one single or one group of 100% shareholders. You can change in a year's time. You decide, all of this, I don't want to do it. I want to run this company this way. And there's nobody to question you. No, external directors, you are the ones who hired them, right? If they don't agree with you, you can fire them and hire new ones, right? Right? Because this is what I'm saying. As long as you are in control of 100% of the company, they will all sing to your tune. Okay. Typically, a smart private equity group, what they do, because they incur. I mean, let's say your typical $15, $20 million transaction, by the time you are at the due diligence stage or definite document stage, they've spent $300,000, right? So what they would do is if you have signed a term sheet, they will have a break fee. That if you, as an investee company, decide to pull out, you'll pay a certain break fee. And that break fee is typically tied to the cost that they have, approximately the cost that they have incurred, right? So, and that would be in the term sheet, all right? It could also happen that they could pull out. So the break fee could work both ways. But typically, when they pull out, a lot of times they pull out because they find something in the due diligence that's not to their liking, right? Now, due diligence phase is also a tricky phase, right? Because they can find things that they can fix, either through remedial action or through adjusting the price. But there are certain things they can't fix. They can find that you have a big taxation liability, which is could potentially be bigger than their investment amount, right? They can find you have a legal case or an environmental issue. So right now we're looking at we're advising on the buy side a global company on an agrochemical group, and the discussion is around indemnities and warranties on environmental related, because it's a chemical group, right? So that's where the discussion is, right? Because they have gone in and they realize a 56-year-old company, there could be a lot of spillage that have happened in the last 30, 40 years. They don't know what is the quality of the soil there.
So if the PE decides to pull out and they have to America?
You see, it depends on what you have negotiated in the term sheet, right? If you have negotiated a two-way break fee, they will have, but if they have good reason, so you have to think about why would a private equity group pull out? Because they really want to give money, right? They will pull out primarily if they find something in the due diligence report that's really explosive. If it's not really explosive, it can be mitigated through, adjustment in valuation or indemnities and warranties. Right?
While they're doing the due diligence,
Our advice, when we advise investee companies or sell-side companies, first thing we always say, disclose everything you can. Everything, right? Sometimes you can say, but, I don't really, there are certain things I don't know. Fine, but disclose. Because what happens is when the transaction is consummated, and this happens in any typical M&A transaction, not just private equity transaction, you have a full disclosure letter. So you said we've disclosed this, all the documents you list, everything tangible, intangible, you put it in there. So the first rule is always disclose, even the small thing that you think would be of no consequence, just disclose it, right? Worst that can happen is if you don't disclose something and they find out later. Because it may not have a tangible price to it, but you're going in a partnership with them. And the expectation from both sides is that it's of openness, right? So in the spirit of that openness, you should disclose everything, right? Because I think sooner or later they'll find out, whatever it is. Yeah, sorry, Neil.
how do you pick between different private equity funds?
How do you pick between different brands? Okay, that's an interesting question. So, look, easy answer is you may ask us, but the way to do it is we actually did it for, we're in the middle of a transaction, so I can't disclose it, but we've done it. So what we did is, first of all, this group said, we don't want too many people to know about it, right? So find us two groups, right, that you think will fit our profile. This is our profile. These are the type of people we are. Find us two groups that will fit our profile. So we found them two groups. We sat with their senior management team, the group CEO, the group CFO, and the group project head. And we created a list of pros and cons for them. A whole list of pros and cons on what, and then we gave them the list internally, the family together with their senior management, debated it, and then they gave us a name. Took us about 4 or 5 weeks, right? What are you looking for? Look, the point is it's going to be a 5, 6, 7-year relationship, right? So other than value is an important factor. Private equity group A may pay you higher than private equity group B, but a lot of times it's a number, right? More importantly, in my view, is what's the chemistry like? What's the rapport like? How flexible are they, right? Because every family, every company has a different dynamic. And what you need to understand is, are these guys going to be the type of people that you are happy to work with over the next 3, 4, 5 years or not, right? So if you were selling a company, cold, hard-nosed, walk in, walk out, take my shares, give me the money, I'll say take the highest value. But even then, you may want to think about it because it's not that easy, right? It's a 3, 4, 5 month process, right? But when you are dealing with private equity group, somebody who's going to be your partner, somebody who's going to take up 30, 40% stake in your company, you really want to assess the intangibles. And the intangibles primarily are around the flexibility of the group, of the people that are running that private equity group, how well you click with them. Do you guys have the same vision? That's the other thing. what you need to make sure is that your private equity group is aligned with your vision, right? Remember, private equity group in the short term has the same alignment as you. But as time passes, they are thinking of exit. You're thinking of further growing your company, they're thinking of exit, right? So you need to make sure that you're all aligned. Let's say what you do is you are preparing your company for a private equity investment, right? And your desire is to go to 3, 4, 5 players who can give you better value, right? So in this case, what you do is you hire an accounting firm that most likely, hopefully, is not your auditor, and you ask them to do a full-scale due diligence. So the reason it's called vendor because you are the vendor. It's vendor-led. So you are the ones who have instructed it, right? And it helps. It speeds up the process because third-party due diligence can take 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, right? So it speeds up the process. And it's not that they will not do their own due diligence, the incoming investor, but the nature of the due diligence then changes because a lot of the information is already provided for, then it could become a restrictive or a confirmatory due diligence, right? So you got a KPMG doing your due diligence. You could have the incoming parties could recruit, you could ask or could engage a PKF or an E&Y to say, okay, the information is available, can you please do a confirmatory due diligence? Depending on the nature and complication of the transaction, they would still want to do a full-scale due diligence, right? But the fact that you have put all the documents together helps. Secondly, how does the vendor due diligence help you? It helps you with the remedial action. Because one thing I always find is when companies go through a due diligence, even an external due diligence, they all say, wow, we didn't know about this, we didn't know about that. Great, this is a great finding. It allows you to fix things, right? Simple things like under your memos and articles, which were probably compiled on a copy and paste basis 25, 30 years ago, your directors may not have powers of borrowing. It may only be your shareholders, right? And then as the generation changes and the kids come in, they may not be shareholders, they may be directors of the company, right? And they're signing off all these board resolutions, not realizing they actually don't have the powers of borrowing under the memos, right? So what does that mean? That's something that's established in your due diligence, right? So it's a matter of now remediating it, right? So you pass a resolution, a special resolution, backwards, looking back, that sorts that out, right? It could be also about your capital structure, right? Your memos and art could be restricted on that. Your memos and art could be restricted in the nature of business that you can do, and it's expanded over the last 30 years. They may find that you have some health and safety issues that you need to sort out, or you have some minor tax issues, more housekeeping issues than any major issues that you need to sort out. So a vendor due diligence always helps you cleaning it up. But again, you have to be careful. I mean, if you're a company that has $1 million EBITDA, you don't want to incur a $30,000, $40,000 due diligence charge either, right? It's a matter of economics as well. So what are the areas of concerns? What are the private equity groups really concerned about when they're doing deals in East Africa or Africa in general, right? The first big one is developing a pipeline. Private equity world is a small world. So they all come to know the same deals. And then those are, quote unquote, becomes the good deals to invest in, right? And then all that money starts chasing those deals, valuation goes haywire. So really, and again, most of the family-owned companies that one comes across, they don't want to dilute. They don't want to sell, right? So it's difficult for these guys to develop a pipeline, especially the larger private equity groups, right? Another problem is appropriate funding structure, right? Typically, your typical mindset of a typical mid to large size family-owned company is, this is the money we put in, and then every year our retained earnings are there, and this is the debt we put in. And then all the growth, they try to achieve it through a combination of additional debt and retained earnings that they have, right? They haven't thought about other capital structures, starting with external equity, mezzanine as well, right? So that's not there, because you can improve your returns by introducing quasi-equity, right? And companies don't really, especially in the African context, the capital structuring is not very sophisticated. Quasi-equity is kind of mezzanine. It sits in between debt and equity. All right? And it has a return depending on if it's close to debt or close to equity, it has an in-between return. Right? Yeah. I mean, look, let me give you an example of quasi-equity. Right? You want to buy, you're in the computer business, so there's another target company that you have, right? That's going to cost you $10 million, right? It's a nice round figure, right? You go to the bank and say, you go to a sophisticated enough bank, because banks are also not that sophisticated in this market unless you go to an international bank. And you say, I need an acquisition finance funding because I want to buy this company, right? Now, in the East African context, again, we have limitations, we have restrictions with our Companies Act. So you can't just get, because there's something like financial assistance, thin capitalization issues, right? So let's say you find an innovative way to access debt to fund your acquisition. Even then, the banks would be hesitant to fund more than 50, 60% of the acquisition price, right? And you realize this is a great buy, but I only have 25 or 30%. So I only have $3 million. My bank is going to give me $5 to $6 million. I have a gap of $1 to $2 million. Let's say bank is going to give you $6 million. You have $2 million, and you have a gap of $2 million. What choices do you have? You bring in another partner, you become 50-50, right? And let's say your target return is 30%. That's the only reason why this is attractive, because you can benefit from synergies, you can do various things, right? So suddenly you start thinking of mezzanine. Mezzanine is enabling capital, right? So you go to a mezzanine fund or a mezzanine provider, they'll charge you 17%, 18%. Don't think of it as debt, expensive debt. Think of it as cheap equity, right? 17, 18%, you get your deal done. So you've paid a lot more than senior debt, but you have paid a lot less than your target return, right? Because the other alternative would have been to go to somebody and say, come in for a 50% partner, right? Now, typical private equity groups like mezzanine, because it's kind of an arbitrage, right? If they can bring in a mezzanine into the company, into their structure, the cost would be 15 or 16%, still lower than their target return of 25%. So they benefit from the 10% return or 5% or whatever that arbitrage is, right? So the problem in a market like Sub-Saharan Africa is we haven't reached as corporates or as businesses, as entrepreneurs, we haven't reached that level of sophistication to feel comfortable with mezzanine. We're not comfortable with equity. So of course, it's going to take us some time before we get comfortable with mezzanine. Yeah. In this market, in the last 3-4 years, genuine mezz transactions, probably 5 or 6. Because mezzanine, people need to get comfortable with. Because your first mindset is this is expensive debt, right? You need to think it as cheap equity. So much money is chasing good deals. People start thinking their company is worth, initially they're thinking X. Somebody comes to them and says, let me invest in your company. I'll pay you 1.5 times X. And then next guy comes and says, I'll pay you 1.7 times. Suddenly they start thinking, wow, my company is worth 2 times X. And so these days, valuation is an issue. And for private equity group, they want to make sure that they don't overpay. Because if they overpay, they will not be able to achieve their target returns on exit, right? So that concerns them quite a bit. Of course, the legal, regulatory, and tax-related environment. We have Kenya Competition Authority. It can take you 2-3 months to get those approvals, especially if you're doing a majority transaction. If you are in a regulated industry, you need to get regulatory approval. So communication, for example, financial institutions, for example, right? Taxation issues always come up, right? In terms of, first of all, what is disclosed vis-a-vis taxation issue, what comes out during the due diligence, and then what kind of indemnities and warranties the sponsors are willing to provide. That's always a tough discussion. Okay. If there are cross-border transactions, it can get even more complicated, right? Because suddenly you may need COMESA, Competition Authority approval. You may need 2 or 3 in-country approvals. Okay. You may need a structure offshore, right? So these can, again, it just adds to time, right? I was being asked a question, how long does a typical M&A transaction or private equity transaction take? It can take anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half, because every situation is different and there is not a lot in your control. And I've learned one thing, is that anything that can go wrong will possibly go wrong. You know, so you just have to be prepared for it. Okay. So when you are thinking about private equity, so we talked about a couple of things. We talked about internally making sure you have the buy-in of your partners, your family members, your other shareholders. We talked about that, right? We talked about maybe doing a vendor due diligence is a great idea, right? What are the other ways? Structuring consideration. You got to think about jurisdiction, right? Why are you thinking of jurisdictions? You're thinking of jurisdictions, and I'm saying you need to think about onshore versus offshore in terms of creating a holding company structure. You may be perfectly happy just doing onshore. But if you have multi-country ambition, you want to be in 3-4 countries, then maybe offshore holding co structure may come into. So you need to think about jurisdiction, right? You may want to think about jurisdiction from a taxation point of view. You want to think about jurisdiction from an investment treaty protection point of view, right? These are the reasons. Why do people structure offshore transactions? Because that's another way to get around any future capital gains tax issues. If you have double taxation treaties, you can significantly reduce withholding tax on your royalties, on your dividends, on your management fees, right? So it's basically, you do offshore structuring to bring transaction efficiencies into your structure, right? But when you're thinking of jurisdiction, think about which jurisdictions accord you that double taxation treaties, investment protection treaty, right? You need to think about disclosure of beneficial owners. Most of you may not have that issue. Some of you may have issues. You may not want to disclose yourselves or your family members as ultimate beneficial shareholders. Important thing about reputation of jurisdiction, right? BVI is a great structure, but when you mention BVI, people start thinking tax dodging, right? So you need to think about, you know, in Africa, most of the people, genuine businesses go to Mauritius, right? Singapore is another interesting jurisdiction to look at, all right? The other thing you need to think about when you're looking at those jurisdictions is the reporting obligations in those jurisdictions. Some of them have very rigorous reporting obligations. The other things that you need to think about is what are the rights that your strategic or your private equity shareholder is going to require, right? They would want board seats. So you need to think about it. How many board seats are you're willing to give up depending on the shareholding split that you have? They would want to have a say in key decision making. I've mentioned to you CAPEX, acquisitions, disposals, hiring of senior people, right? What type of shares will you issue to them? A lot of private equity groups invest in your company through a convertible issue. You need to be careful how those convertibles are issued, because if your company gets into trouble a year later, they may not convert. It sits as debt. What happens then? That means that they are not equity holders, they are debt holders. You need to think about that. Yeah? If they're buying majority, they may tie you up with non-compete. Maybe within the country, depending on your coverage, could be across East Africa. You need to think about, do you want to be tied in for non-compete? Maybe it's fair that you should be, but for how long? They will ask for 10 years. Is that realistic? Right? And then, of course, linked to the input on key strategic decision is reserve board matters and minority protection rights for private equity shareholders who are minority investors. Right? critical, as I mentioned to you before, think of exit rights. When you are talking to private equity groups, very important, think about exits, right? Rights of first refusal, tag along and drag along right. What's not there, I mentioned to you, structuring of the put option. All right, I can't emphasize enough on the put option, right? You can really get yourself in a big problem if you haven't structured the put option right, okay? Now, valuation methodologies, you need to think about it when you're bringing in a partner, right? You could look at the multiples approach. You could look at DCF, discounted cash flow approach. You can look at replacement cost, right? Replacement cost is, Kavan, what I was explaining to you is basically if I go in, put in a brand new plant, this is what's going to cost me. It's going to take me 2 years plus another 2-3 years to break into the market. These are the profits I'm foregoing. So this is my replacement valuation, all right? Then I mentioned to you about if you are projecting a very aggressive business plan compared to your historical performance, the investor, whether it's strategic or whether it's private equity, they may put up earn-out clauses, right? So again, clawback and earn-out clauses, right? Achieve this much and your valuation goes up by that much and you can get some extra earn-out, right? So you need to think about that. Earn-outs can be very difficult because if they take over control of your company, they'll run it in whatever way they feel fit, right? And you may not be able to achieve your targets by no fault of your own, right? So agreeing to earn out because you believe in the business plan may not be always the right strategy, especially if you're selling majority and they're going to run the company, right? I'll give you a situation where there's a financial transaction took place. A big international bank bought a investment banking firm like ours, much bigger though. And there was an earn-out. So the senior management of that investment advisory bank got 50% or 60% upfront, and they remained with 40%, which they were to receive through earn-out based on achieving certain targets. And this bank, what it was doing post-acquisition was booking a lot of the fees of those transactions and advisory transactions in its London office or its Dubai office, whereas the earn-out agreement was based on the bank's Kenya book performance, right? So they missed out on quite a bit through no fault of their own, right? Because they were not, post-acquisition, they were not in the decision-making position. So you got to think about that as well. Right? So on the private equity side, I'll tell you the jury is still out, because other than some of the old-time private equity groups like Oreos, most of the private equity groups that have been active in the last 5-6 years are now coming to the first round of their exits. So I would say on the private equity exits, by and large, the jury is still out, right? Can they exit at the multiples that they went in with or went in with thinking that they can get, right? On infrastructure deal, it's actually, if you structure it right, it's not that difficult. Why is that? Your typical infrastructure transaction is a very well-structured transaction. Your debt-to-equity parameters are very well-defined. Your typical infrastructure transaction is going to have 20 to 25% equity, 75 to 80% debt, right? And there may be a small mezzanine tranche in between, right? It has a fairly predictable cash flow, all right? And it has an off-taker. If it's a power project, through a power purchase agreement. If it's a infrastructure road project, through a toll agreement or whatever it is, right? So it has a fairly defined purchase agreement, off-taking agreement. And what that means is once the project is implemented, you can sell it on a yield basis. It's no different from putting up a commercial building and then sell it on a yield basis. Once you've put it up, you're getting a let's say $2 million rental from it, and then you work on a 8, 9, 10, 11% yield value basis and sell it. Right? Power projects, infrastructure projects are similar because the cash flow is fairly predictable. All right, so you can sell it. Now, can you list it? You can also list it, but it's difficult to list one project. You could list a serial developer, right? It's easier to sell that equity to long-term investors. Who are your long-term investors? Pension funds. long-term investment funds, right? So we're doing the same thing. We're in the middle of advising on a power project that's actually in the development phase, and we are selling equity down, primarily to pension funds, right? Because pension funds, what are they looking for? They're looking for 12, 13, 14% IRR return, something that they can have for 10, 15 years, something that pays them decent dividends, all right? So the point I'm trying to make is every nature of transaction, nature of industry has its own particular exits that you really need to think about. Yeah. I mean, look, there are many. By the way, most of it is positive, right? I've just highlighted a few things because I want you guys, because a lot of you guys probably are being approached by private equity groups at this stage. And I just want you to kind of think about critical points as you're thinking. Most of the private equity experience has been very positive. So think about, or strategic investors. So think about Helios's investment in equity. It's worked extremely well, right? Think about Centum. Take Centum, for example. Centum is actually a slightly different than private equity group. It's a listed investment group. Think about the investments that it has made. Most of them have been very positive. Tiger Barnes' investment in Haku has been very positive, both for the buyers and the sellers, right? Look at Orios. Orios' investment in Ate River Mining that was done in the late 90s, right? Orios has done many great investments and have exited a lot of them. Think about Orios' investment in the Sumaria Group in their pharmaceutical business, which jointly they sold the majority to Aspen Pharmaceutical. That's a great example of a successful private equity investment and a successful exit, right? Ate River, successful exit was achieved through a listing. First it was a private placement and then a listing, right? Look at Family Bank, right? You had some institutional investors like Africa Invest in there. They have now exited, and KTDA has come in as an investor, right? So successful investment, successful exits, right? So I think by and large, the private equity investor has been positive. The strategic investors has been positive. You will find every now and then things don't work out according to plan, right? So you will have a few distress cases. Yeah, but generally it's positive. As I said, as a recipient of private equity money, you just need to make sure that you don't tie yourself up in terms and conditions that can prove onerous down the road. Okay. Sorry, you had a question.
I have several.
Go ahead.
NDA.
Yes.
Normally, PE would ask you to sign an NDA.
Normally you would ask a PE to sign an NDA. Yeah, because you are disclosing your information to them.
Is there anything to look out in the NDAs?
Okay, it depends whether you're a receiving party or a disclosing party, right? If you're a disclosing party, you want to make sure it is as tight as possible. You make sure that it has a non-circumvention clause. They can't circumvent you. Based on their information, they can't go to your competitor and say, oh, let's do a deal. We know a lot about your competitor.
What should be the time frame?
Ask for whatever you can get. Ask for 3 years. They won't agree to more than 6 months or a year. Ask for 3 years, right? What do you think is the period after which your confidential information will become stale? Depends on country to country, company to company. 1 year, 18 months is reasonable, I'd say. 1 year to 18 months is reasonable. So ask, again, whom should it be? Whom can they disclose it to, right? Because your strategic investor or your private equity investor would hire external consultants. So you want to limit the number of parties that they can actually disclose it to, right? That's also very important.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
How do you determine that somebody has actually disclosed any information? What's the follow-up on signing an NDA?
Very difficult. NDA is a big gray area. So what you're saying is, let's say a private equity group approached you, you disclose the information to that private equity group, and they have in turn disclosed it. They've actually breached that NDA. Is that what you're saying? And disclose it to a third party. Very difficult. Very difficult. I don't really have an answer to that because you won't know for quite some time. And it's a real gray area because, the dispute under an NDA are typically resolved through arbitration, right? I mean, you're not going to take somebody to court and incur a big bill. So it's resolved through arbitration. It's a big gray area.
Just something very quickly I could add. We signed a couple of NDAs. They did not give any paperwork, but they said everything was what they do.
Yeah.
Disclosure, but then how do you
Yeah. It's difficult. I mean, NDAs and non-competes are very difficult to implement. Like in a Kenyan or an East African court of law, non-compete is very difficult. If you can prove your livelihood depends on this particular knowledge that you have of industry, or the court will rule in your favor. They will put aside the non-compete. Yeah, look, the NDAs, in my view, the NDAs, NCDAs, which are non-circumvent agreements, and non-compete, these are moral obligations, right? These are moral obligations. They may not, you can get around it legally, right? You can, I disclose your information to somebody, you come to me and I'll say, what is your proof? Difficult for you to prove that right? So the point is, if I've signed something, I have a moral obligation. So, I mean, it depends on what moral standards I have. That's what it comes down to, right?
Is there a PE investor due diligence process, right?
Yes.
He would do a due diligence.
Oh, yes, they will always do a due diligence.
No.
As in, you will do a due diligence on that? Actually, the way it works is this. What they will tell you is find out whatever you can about us through public sources, number one. Then, we will introduce you to our investors, their investors, and our investee companies, other companies that we've invested in. Talk to them, get comfortable. So they will do that. They will introduce you to 2 or 3 of their key investors. Could be some of their anchor investor, could be the family offices that have invested in them. Talk to a few of them, right? If you're mobile, go and meet them wherever they are, in London, New York, Washington, Dubai, etc. Then they will say, okay, we invested in this company in Ghana. Talk to them about what is their experience working with us over the last 2 years. Talk to this other company in Botswana that we invested in. What's their experience, right? So that's the kind of a soft due diligence that you will do on them. Because what else can you do? I mean, you're not going to kind of question them about their source of money or whether they have the capacity or not, right? Because, I mean, you take it as a given.
See, but the way I look at it is I will profile a potential PE investor. And I would say that I do not have rush right now.
Yeah. Understood. But those things you don't need to go into too much due diligence. Those things you can get on the surface because, that's like a pre-selection process, right? Right? Pre-selection. So 8 people have approached you and you said, let's narrow it down to 2. And then it's really those 2 that you're going to now look at various aspects. What can the money do for you? Who are the people behind this private equity? Can they take you to different countries, right? So Neil, you're asking these questions, right? These are some of the other things. Can they open doors for you, right? We had a private equity group that's interested in doing a deal with one of the big industrial groups, right? And what those guys said, look, we don't need your money. We have money, or we have access to money. What we need is, can you bring deals to us? Right? Bring 2 or 3 deals that we want to do in West Africa, bring into the table, and we'll do it together. Right? So can they open doors for you? Can they open new lines for you? Can they bring technology to you? Can they provide you with an additional distribution network? Then can they get you a license somewhere? I mean, it all depends on really, other than the fact that they bring you money, they can improve corporate governance, which everybody can do. What else can they do? I mean, so Satya has a calling card, right? You've got Mo Ibrahim, right? Kingdom has a calling card, right? You've got Al-Walid, right? Then somebody else has a calling card, right? Because we have Rothschilds behind us, or we have Soros behind us, right? Carlyle Group is active in Kenya, in Sub-Saharan Africa. They'll tell you we're Carlyle, right? You go to Helios, they will tell you we are Helios. We do big deals. We make big things happen in Africa, right? We dream big. We do big things. So so other than this basic money and corporate governance and all that, what are you looking for and who can help you achieve it?
Can we invest in PE funds?
Yes, you can.
Is that easy or difficult?
Not difficult. They will do a fair amount of due diligence to make sure that source of your money is clean, because these days KYC, AML issues have become major problem. But you can invest, for example, Helios, Catalyst Capital. Many private family and family offices have invested in them. Right?
Is there, that sounds weird, but is there a simple place to go? If I want to sell my business tomorrow, how do I, as a family business, never got into big deals before, I mean, this is basic. Where do they go? Do they come to you or to the CTF or and say, listen, I want to sell my business? Show me how.
Yeah. I mean, look, a lot of time you start. So if you're not very well-experienced deal maker, that can happen to you whether you own a small business or a big business. If you are not a seasoned deal maker, because you focus on your work, you focus on building your company. So your first discussion you will have is with your CFO or your FC, right? Because that's the go-to finance person, right? So you'll talk to him most likely. He will have some ideas. Your second go-to person would be your auditor. You'll talk to the auditor. Give you some ideas, right? Then you could talk to, within your circle, you may think there are few people who are savvy in the deal-making world. You could talk to them. And you'll get various feedbacks. The feedback you will get is, do you want to do a walk-in, walk-out deal? Right? Wherein, here's my company, here's my shares, pay me X amount, I walk out, you walk in. All right? This is the old way of doing deals. Yeah, let's shake hands. You buy my company, I buy. Paperwork can go on later, and sometimes that paperwork is literally 1 or 2 pages. Right? These days, because of the complication of transaction, tax issues, liability issues, all of that, you want to get into a proper share purchase agreement. Right? So even walk in, walk out can take a bit of time, 3 months, 4 months. Willing buyer, willing seller, even then it can take 6 months. Okay. So then, as you kind of start thinking about it, you start widening your network. So you've talked to your financial controller, finance director, you've talked to your auditor, you've talked to 1 or 2 people in your circle, and then you get some ideas. And then maybe somebody will refer them to us or another investment banking or financial consulting house, right? And maybe they will take it seriously or not, because of course, now they will have to start paying for that service, right? Up till now, it has been just a discussion. So depending on whether they are willing to pay or not, whether they feel ready or not, that discussion can go on further. A lot of times, 2 people get together. One says, I'll sell you my business. The other says, I'll buy your business. And then they just go to lawyers and do a deal. You'd be surprised how many deals are still done that way, especially in the SME sector. Better to buy assets in this market, because then you can get a tax shield. It's a tax efficient transaction. You can essentially claim on various allowances, all right, accelerated depreciation and so forth. So it's always, and your due diligence is minimized because you're not taking, if you structure it well, you're not taking the liabilities, the off balance sheet liabilities of the company. Problem with the seller, we have something in Kenya called the compensating tax, and we have the balance, off balance charge, right? So sellers typically, because of the tax that they can incur on this, don't want to sell you assets. Right? They would want to sell you the company, the shares of the company. Okay? So that's usually the play that you have. So there is some kind of a compromise you need. If you have a very savvy buyer who has done his calculation to assess his level of tax efficiency, let's say it's a $20 million transaction, and they've assessed that by buying assets, they have a $3 million benefit. You put it on the paper and say, look, if we buy shares, transaction goes down to 17 million. Now the seller says, hey, at 17, I'm not selling, right? So then you, of course, is a matter of now negotiating and compromising, right? But typically, sellers want to sell company shares, and buyers want to buy company assets. Now that's a very peculiar, I think, East Africa, especially Kenya-centric, because of compensating tax and so forth.
Would you deal with the SME sector and buying of assets and acquisition, finance
We do. I mean, there is the leverage buyouts and acquisition finance. That's one of our areas of specialty. We do a lot of that. We do a lot of LBOs, LBO advising. Yeah, there is East African Venture Capital Association, EAVCA, right? Yeah, you can talk to them. They'll give you a whole list. I suspect they would have it. Yeah, I mean, they have some of the private equity guys may not have registered, but you can. Then there is also Africa Venture Capital Association, AVCA, which is a lot more comprehensive. But that's now all the Africa-wide players. Okay.
One word, wow.
So many great entrepreneurs.
Beautiful learning.
Inspirational stories.
Amazing experience.
Very interesting.